Hello, and welcome to Catholicism in the Car. My name is Parker Zerbal. Today I want to talk about an argument for metaphysical realism. The reason I want to give this argument is because I believe firmly that almost all of our cultural ills, cultural confusions in Western society today have their roots in a non-realist metaphysics, or really in no metaphysics at all. Realism is a philosophical idea, philosophical paradigm, I like to say, that looks at concepts as not just creations of the human mind, but looks at them as real, as parts of reality in some way. Now, there are various kinds of realism, and I've gone over these at other times, so I won't do that here. I want to argue for realism in general, as opposed to, you could say, a nominalist perspective, a conceptualist perspective, or a purely materialist perspective, a skeptical perspective. I want to argue for this realist metaphysics. First, I want to mention some points that bolster up a realist perspective. And then I want to talk about the epistemology here and what the limits are. So some things that can give support, although not proof, to realist metaphysics is the observation of children as they grow. The observation of children as they grow. Children see beauty in the world. They get joy. They get this bodily chemical reaction of joy, of pleasure, of enthrallment when they see something beautiful. Now, as you'll see, this argument for realism is an argument for the reality of beauty, the reality of truth, and the reality of goodness. Okay, these in scholastic philosophy are known as the transcendentals. The transcendentals. So children, they see goodness, they see truth, they see beauty before they can even conceptualize these things, before they're able to say, oh, that is goodness, that is truth, that is beauty. They can't even identify these things with their minds, with their intellects, but yet they understand them. They experience them. They experience these things before they understand them, before they're able to reflect upon them. So that, I would say, is one argument for realism. Because the nominalist or conceptualist perspective posits that man, that these concepts are made up by man. They're just names we give them, hence nominalism, or they're just concepts in the mind. They're not real in reality. They're not part of reality. So I would argue, first off, from this observation of how children experience the world before they can even understand it. Also, and many of these arguments are, I think, going to be from experience. Because this we observe it most clearly in children because their intellectual faculties have not been developed enough yet. And so really you see a pure version of this. But I would argue that everyone, we encounter reality before we understand reality. So I encounter a beautiful sunset, and I encounter it as beautiful before I give it the concept of beauty, before I call it beautiful. I don't call a sunset beautiful, and therefore it is beautiful to me. That would be quite preposterous. That would take someone being like Spock from Star Trek, with no emotional capacity, affective capacity at all, and he would look at a sunset and just analyze it, and maybe come to a determination that, oh, this sunset is beautiful because of the way that the color scheme is and the way that the light is reflecting off the clouds and all these sorts of things. No, that is not what makes a sunset beautiful. And we know this by our experience. William of Ockham is known generally as the father of this nominalistic point of view. And what is often considered his source, the source in his own thought for this view is his Occam's razor, which says that the simplest explanation for something is the right one. And this was largely a reaction to the scholastics of his day, who were kind of in all these highfalutin dialogues about the various natures of realism and which type of realism to accept, and it became quite impractical, became quite divorced from reality. It became kind of like a philosopher's fancy, you could say. And so he was reacting to this kind of overt, saturated realism by saying, no, we don't need all that fancy stuff trying to explain how, is there a world of forms, or is there a substance accidents distinction, or is it all these different types of realism, and it was getting so complex. He just looked at all that and he said, you know what? I think the simpler explanation would just be that man gives these things names. Dogness, for example, is just a name. It's just a way that man is able to categorize all the dogs that he sees. But that has no real connection to reality. It's just a semantic thing. And at first, I would imagine this view would seem quite refreshing, just as do all views. When there's a majority view and everybody takes it and they start arguing over the nuances of it, it begins to, if you're observing this, you begin to see the idiosyncrasies of that view, and it becomes less appealing. And so you just want to say, well, there's got to be a simpler view here. There's got to, and maybe just try to cut the whole tree down at the trunk, take out the roots and burn it, and just start with something new. And that was kind of what Ockham did. As he said, we don't need all this stuff. It's too complex. Things should be simpler to understand. And so, you just cut down the whole tree. And I would say he was throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And I don't think Ockham understood all of the logical entailments of his premise. I definitely do not think that he saw how devastating his theory was to not just Catholicism or classical Christianity, but classical thought. This nominalism, it in my view, it can become where the person starts to look so much inside their own head, because it ultimately posits that reality is created in the mind. That the real natures of things, the connections we make, they're just in the mind. And man is able to create them at will. So treeness, I see trees, the thing that differentiates them from a bush, it's all that it is a human construct. It has no basis in reality. It's just a human construct. All that there are individual trees. And this is a very, very modern way of thinking. This is the majority view today. Scientism is really founded upon this philosophy. And to a certain extent, it's bolstered by it. But I think it falls apart once we get to the quantum realm. And I think that quantum physics, it's fascinating. But I think that quantum physics gives us some great proofs for realism. Let's take quantum computing, for example. This is an up-and-coming technology based upon, as far as I know, I'm no expert in this by any stretch of the imagination. With the little that I know about it, I find it fascinating. It's based upon a concept that's been observed called spooky action at a distance. And this is when one incredibly tiny particle, I think generally they're called quarks, or strings. One of these particles is moved or altered in some way, like if you were to pluck a string. And then they're able to observe that somewhere else, I mean, sometimes this can be quite a ways away, another of these particles moves in the exact same way. Like there's some connection between them. There's some connection between them that binds them together, but that is completely unobservable. As far as we know, there's no time lapse between when the one moves and the other moves. They, as far as we can tell, they're exactly synchronous. And we know of nothing that would be able to connect them. Now, just because we don't know it doesn't mean we won't find it eventually. But I think this proves that the deeper down we go into the quantum world, into smaller and smaller bits of reality, we begin to see that reality is not made up of parts in the end. Like it's not like there are like individual particles, like light. You think about light. Light is a particle, but it's also a wave. Atoms are made up of individual particles, but they're also made of waves. They're clouds of particles and waves, and the further we look, the more obscure it gets. I mean, you can easily think of a particle. You can think of a particle as something that has a real existence, and it's observable, it's trackable, all these things. But a wave? Can you dissect a wave? A wave is more of a concept than a physical thing. But yet we're able to observe it physically in minute ways. Now, how is this an argument for realism? Well, because it shows that things are connected in ways that are impossible, or at least as we know, are impossible to observe. Things are connected in ways that we do not know how to observe or explain. So it could very well be that the treeness of a tree, the reason we see them as connected is because at the quantum level, they are connected in some way. And like I said, this starts to get really foggy. Like it starts to kind of jump out of what we would consider physics. And it kind of goes into like this pure type of science where we're observing things from an experimental level. But like they're not physical. They're not physical. They're not made of parts. They're fluid in like the fullest sense of that word. Like a wave. So I think this is yet another argument for realism. And I think that what comes coming back to it. Coming back to it. Now, I want to also next time argue that the effects of a non-realist metaphysics are an argument for realism. That the logical entailments of anti-realism